So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Catherine Mansfield's short story, The Fly. We have had already a few lectures on this story, and we began to wind up this particular text. Now, we are moving into, with this lecture today, we move into the really, the climactic part of the story, the text, and we examine and hopefully unpack how that's important for us for the purpose of this course and feminist writings. Because how does it play up the different performative qualities of gender, and how are the stereotypical notions about gender problematized in this particular section. Now, we have seen how the figure of the boss in the story, for instance, is obviously a figure of authority, a figure of privilege. At the beginning of the story, he seems to enjoy a little privilege. He seems to enjoy assert, articulate authority, in complete contrast to which we have Woodfield, who is fragile, weak, senile, and who has difficulty remembering, etc. And then, of course, we have little objects, little signifiers, such as the whiskey, the Financial Times, the phallic paper knife, the new furniture, etc. And we have, the boss offers Woodfield whiskey, and after Woodfield drinks the whiskey, he remembers what he wanted to tell the boss. And then we get to know, as readers of the story, that this is actually a story about mourning fathers who are mourning the death of their sons in the war. And then we get to know that Woodfield had a son, and he lost his son in the war, and now his son is buried in a grave in Belgium. And that interestingly, that burial site is visited by not Woodfield, by his wife and daughters, whereas the boss and Woodfield have never been there. Presumably, the boss has never been to that particular graveyard. And Woodfield tells the boss, and through that we get to know that the boss too has lost his son in the war. Just something which we did not know before, although there was this interesting hint at the beginning of the story where there was a mention of the spectral photograph in the boss's desk. So among all the other new things that the boss had surrounded himself with, there was this very odd photograph of the boy in uniform, which was there in the boss's office. So now it makes sense, now it adds up, now we get to know that the boss too had lost his son in the war. Now, Woodfield delivers that information that the Woodfield son and the boss's son are buried together in the same grave, and then it's beautifully looked after. The wife and the girls went there. And then interestingly, we also saw how the discourse of the particular conversation changed from Woodfield's perspective. He started talking about that burial site, that graveyard, as some kind of a touristy spot. He talks about the, for instance, the price of jams in the hotels in Belgium. And then we find out, we connect that to something which we call now trauma tourism. The entire idea of people moving and traveling to different parts of the world to see the graveyards, the burial sites of the beloved ones, which was something which began to boom after the First World War. So as you know, the tourism industry, for instance, really took off after the First World War, with people traveling in different parts of the world to see the burial sites of the beloved ones. And in this case, we have the Woodfield's daughter and daughters and wife going to Belgium to take a look at their son's grave, Reggie's grave. And the boss obviously has never been there. Now, what is interesting in the story from this point is how the boss begins to assign a degree of privilege to his loss, right? And that becomes part of the masculinity package of the boss. And we get to see very soon in the story that how the boss considers his loss, the fact that he's lost his son, to be a very unique loss, to be a very, very profound loss. And there is a degree of masculinity and privilege associated with the loss. And he sort of tells himself that he can never live his loss down, and he can never forget or unremember the death of his son. So the death of his son will stay in his mind forever as a fresh trauma. So in a very interesting sense, there is an equation over here between trauma and privilege, right? So the fact that the boss can still experience the trauma even after 6 years, the fact that the boss can still experience a loss even after 6 years, that experientiality, that ability to experience becomes a marker of privilege, becomes a pointer to privilege. And that's something which the story begins to unfold and dramatize this particular section. So before we move on, we dive into the text, which we will in a minute. It's important to understand the discourse at work over here, the gendered discourse at work, because normally and stereotypically in stereotypical imagination, and stereotypical gendered imagination, hysteria is classified or associated with a female condition, with a female disease. There was a discourse about hysteria being the disease of the womb, for instance, something which can only happen to people with womb. So it was definitely feminized as a disease. So the medical equation of hysteria, the medicalization of hysteria, and the feminization of hysteria happen together, at different points of time. But what we have over here is interesting because the boss, at this point in the story, he wants to orchestrate a hysteria. He wants to control his hysteria. He wants to cry at will. He wants to weep at will. So this idea of controlling the hysteria, this idea of hystericizing himself at will in a performative capacity, that becomes part of the masculinity or the masculine agency of the boss, right? So this is what I mean when I say that there's a degree of, there's an equation between trauma and agency over here at work. And that's something which we need to bear in mind before we read the story. But that is part of the masculinity package. That is part of the gendered performance in the war, in this particular story. That a boss, considers himself to be manly enough not to forget the loss of his son, manly enough not to forget the trauma of his son, and he considers himself manly enough to weep at will, to historicize himself at will. So that consideration, that the fact that he considers himself to be manly because he can perform trauma, because he can perform hysteria, because he can perform mourning. So that is a very complex equation at play over here. So the performance of hysteria, the performance of mourning becomes part of the masculinity performance over here. Okay, and so the contrast that the boss would love to project in his fantasies, that the fact that Woodfield has clearly moved on. Woodfield has clearly, lived the loss down. He can now talk about his, the price of jam in the, hotels near the graveyard. The fact that the trauma is not in Woodfield's mind anymore, it's because Woodfield is enervated. Woodfield is exhausted. Woodfield is not man enough or manly enough. But for the boss, it is in his own mind. He can never live the loss down. He can never not remember the originality of the trauma. He can never not remember the fresh content, the fresh quality of the trauma. It will be forever fresh in his mind, right? So that becomes part of the hubris, you might say, or masculine arrogance that the boss happens to have at this point in the story. The fact that he's just considering his trauma or his experience of loss to be unique in a way that can never be lived down or never be overcome in that sense. So, hysteria becomes very much an orchestrated performance, and the orchestra of hysteria is important over here because that's what the boss wants to do. He shuts himself down completely. He instructs his messenger, or secretary, whoever that is, we never quite know, Macy. He instructs him that he will see nobody for half an hour, and then he closes himself down, and then he arranges to weep. And that's what the narrator says over here, which should be on the screen. The door shut, the firm, heavy steps recrossed the bright carpet. The fat body plumped down in the spring chair, and leaning forward, the boss covered his face with his hands. He wanted, he intended, he had arranged to weep. If you look at the flow of verbs over here, which is interesting, he wanted, he desired to weep, so there's a degree of agentic quality about it. He intended, so there's a degree of intentionality about it, and he had arranged to weep. So there's a very interesting, artificially designed quality about his weeping, right? So the fact that he's surrounded himself with objects, and then he's shut himself down in his office space, and now he's designed himself in a way that he can weep. So he arranged to weep. So there's an agentic quality, there's an intentional quality, and of course there's an artificially performative quality about weeping, which is dramatized over here. It had been a terrible shock to him when old Woodfield sprang that remark upon him about the boy's grave. It was exactly as though the earth had opened, and he had seen the boy lying there with Woodfield's girls staring down at him. So again, this becomes a very potent visual signifier. Then Woodfield's girls, the wife and the daughter, staring down at the boy's grave, boss's boy's grave, and the grave opening up, becomes almost a Freudian symbol. And that may be connected to a sense of masculinity crisis that the boss happens to have at this point in time. The fact that he's gazed at by the woman, the fact that he's gazed at by women who are looking at a dead male corpse. So that becomes a very interesting visual signifier of masculinity crisis, which obviously connects to the broader narrative of the violence and loss in the First World War. So this particular image is useful and helpful, and we need to sort of revisit it as we read the story. So as if we've seen the boy lying there with Woodfield's girl staring down at him. For it was strange. Although over 6 years had passed, the boss never thought of the boy except as lying unchanged, unblemished in his uniform, asleep forever. My son, groaned the boss, but no tears came yet. In the first months and even years after the boy is dead, he had only to say those words to be overcome by such grief that nothing short of a violent fit of weeping could relieve him. So again, he's trying to orchestrate hysteria, he's trying to design hysteria, he's trying to produce hysteria or some kind of a cathartic effect. But also, this is what I mean when I say there is a degree of arrogance about it, there's a degree of masculine arrogance and hubris about this whole thing, about this whole situation, because what he's essentially trying to do is trying to control hysteria and trying to weep at will. And his ability to weep at will becomes a manly performance over here. So, he's cries, "My son, groan the boss," but no tears came yet. And now we know, we are told in the first few years, he had only to say those words, and tears would come down, and he'd be flooded with tears, etc. So he could control, he could hystericize himself at will. But now at this point in time, he seems to be unable to do it. Time, he had declared then, he had told everybody, could make no difference. Other men perhaps might recover, might live the loss down, but not he. This is a very clear and direct statement about the masculine arrogance of the boss, and this becomes very much a part of the masculinity package. Other men might live the loss down, other men might recover and move on, but not he, because his loss is unique, because his loss is he's a boss, and his even his loss has a grand, sort of larger than life, profound quality to it, which is incomparable with other men's losses. I mean, his son is his only son. His son has a unique quality to him because he happens to be boss's son. So the loss of his son is immeasurable. And no amount of time, he declares, or he used to declare that, at some point in time, no amount of time can make him forget or the original trauma of the whole experience of loss. So he had told everybody time could make no difference. Other men might perhaps recover, might live the loss down, but not he. How was it possible? His boy was an only son. So again, this whole idea of only becomes important here, because what the boss seems to suggest through this kind of mentality is that his loss is unique, his son was unique, because he's part of the entire thing was part of the boss. So the boss-like quality is obviously part of an authoritative quality, uniquely authoritative, uniquely agentic, uniquely masculine in quality, and everything else compares don't compare to this at all in terms of loss. So even the loss has an originality, has a profound quality, has a unique quality, which is connected, as I mentioned already, with the unique masculinity of the boss. So other men might live the loss down, but not he. So his boy was an only son. Ever since his birth, the boss had worked on building up this business for him. It had no other meaning if it was not for the boy. Life itself had come to have no other meaning. How on earth could he have slaved, denied himself, kept going all these years without a promise forever before him of the boy stepping into his shoes and carrying on where he left off? So, this is the part of the inheritance narrative that the story begins to dramatize away up, because what is essentially being said to us is that the boy was being prepared to step into the boss's shoes. In other words, the boy was prepared to become the next boss. So therein lies the anonymous, almost allegorical quality about the boss's identity. So he'll always be the boss. So, the boy stepping into his shoes will become the next boss, who will hopefully produce another son, who will then step into his next his shoes, and that will just continue ad infinitum. So the boss would never die in that sense. And therein lies the idea of not naming him, not sort of making him some kind of a unique character. So he becomes, in a sense, an allegory of authority, an allegory of privilege, an allegory of hubris or arrogance in that sense. So how on earth could he have slaved, denied himself, kept going all these years without a promise forever before him of the boy stepping into his shoes and carrying on where he left off? So it was it was meant to be part of a continuous narrative of privilege and acquisition and success, etc. All right, and that promise had been so near being fulfilled. The boy had been in the office learning the ropes for a year before the war. Every morning they had started off together, they had come back by the same train. And what congratulations he had received as a boy's father. No wonder he had taken to it marvelously. As to his popularity with the staff, every man jack of them, down to old Macy, couldn't make enough of the boy. And he wasn't in the least spoiled. No, he was just his bright, natural self, with the right word for everybody, with that boyish look and this habit of saying simply splendid. Right? So, we have some kind of a background information about the boy. And so he was very much on the cusp of manhood, at the cusp of becoming the authoritative, agentic man. But he still had a boyish charm, and everyone seemed to love him, etc. So he was very much, on the right track in terms of inheriting the legacy of the boss, the success of the boss, etc. And then, of course, the whole thing ended with the war, with the violence of the war in which he died. but all of it was over and done with as though it never had been. The day had come when Macy had handed him the telegram and that brought the whole place crashing about his head. Deeply regretted to inform me, and he left the office a broken man with his life in ruins. Okay, so this is obviously part of the mass telegrams sent out and dished out and disseminated and posted to all the people who lost their sons in the war. So that telegram came to him as well, which, with a very standardized template of condolence, which said, deeply regret to inform me. And of course, the next information was about the loss of the boss's son. The father had died in the war. And he had left the office a broken man with his life in ruins. 6 years ago, 6 years, how quickly time passed. It might have happened yesterday. The boss took his hands from his face. He was puzzled. Something seemed to be wrong with him. He wasn't feeling as he wanted to feel. He decided to get up and have a look at the boy's photograph, but it wasn't a favorite photograph of his. The expression was unnatural. It was cold, even stern looking. The boy had never looked like that. So, at this point in the story, we have the beginning of the end of the boss's agentic narrative, or the narrative of authority, because he's trying to weep at will, he's trying to have the cathartic effect, or the catharsis of weeping, which is not coming to him. It's denied to him. So no matter how hard he's trying, he's not being able to weep. So he decides to get up, look around, and then takes a look at the boy's photograph, but then he decides it's not really a favorite photograph of his. So he decides, and because he finds expression unnatural, and it's not quite a way that he remembers his son as. And he sort of tells very clearly the boy had never looked like that. At that moment, the boss noticed that a fly had fallen into the broad ink pot, his broad ink pot, and was trying feebly but desperately to clamber out again. Now, so this is a famous fly episode in the story, which is the central episode, the central drama of the story, which obviously is quite symbolic and allegorical in quality. But even if you look at it superficially, we have the image of the fly falling into an ink pot. And what happens is the boss helps the fly to come out of the ink pot, puts the fly on the blotting paper, and then keeps dropping blots of ink on the fly, just to see if it survives or if it doesn't survive. And obviously, in the end, the fly dies. So the whole idea, the whole image, the whole activity becomes sort of Sisyphus in quality, right? Because obviously, I'm alluding to the myth of Sisyphus, who was doomed to push a stone up a hill, and then the stone will come down again the moment it reaches the top of the hill, and Sisyphus will be doomed to push it up again forever ad infinitum. So the whole idea, when I use the Sisyphus myth or the Sisyphus metaphor, it becomes a very potent metaphor of purposelessness, of futility, of superfluity, etc. So he notices the fly has fallen into a broad ink pot and was trying feebly but desperately to clamber out again. So the fly is trying to climb out, but of course is not succeeding. "Help, help," said those struggling legs. But the sides of the ink pot were wet and slippery. It fell back again and began to swim. The boss took up a pen, picked the fly out of the ink, and shook it on a piece of blotting paper. For a fraction of a second, it lay still on the dark patch that oozed around it. Then the front legs waved, took hold, and pulling its small, sodden body up, it began the immense task of cleaning the ink from its wings. Over and under went a leg along a wing, as the stone goes over and under the scythe. So again, a scythe becomes a very traditional archetypal metaphor of death. So if you look at, for instance, the medieval morality plays, which were produced in England in the early 14th century and 15th century, we find that a man with a scythe was, characteristically or typically a personification of death. So we have this death persona, the death instrument, the instrument of death, the object of death being, underlined over here. It appears over here. So the boss, at first, the boss takes the fly out of the ink pot, puts it on a blotting paper, etc., and then he helps it to recover a little bit, and then for a fraction of a second it lays still, and then the front legs begin to move, and it begins to dry itself. Over and under went a leg along a wing, as the stone goes over and under the scythe. So the scythe metaphor is interesting over here. Then there was a pause where the fly, seeming to stand on the tips of its toes, tried to expand first one wing and then the other. It succeeded at last, and sitting down, it began like a minute cat to clean its face. Now, what's interesting is, if you look at it from a visual perspective, the fly seems to be magnified in the boss's imagination, the boss's eyes, and that magnification appears as part of the narrative as well, because we're talking about the face of the fly, we're talking about the legs of the fly. Now, and obviously in normal visual vocabulary, we would not use the word face or legs when you talk about a fly. The fly appears as an almost atomic creature. We just see a fly as one little atom of existence. But the whole thing is magnified, and not just magnified, it's also decelerated. So everything slows down. But the boss is intensely focusing on the fly. And that focus brings about a spatio-temporal defamiliarization. So the space and the time change around the fly. So spatially it becomes expanded, it becomes magnified. We talk about the face, we talk about the legs, we talk about the body of the fly, which obviously in normal visual vocabulary would not appear at all. And then also in terms of time, the whole idea, the whole episode slows down the activity in terms of looking at the fly. So it succeeded at last in sitting down like a minute cat to clean his face. Now one could imagine that if little front legs rubbed against each other lightly, joyfully, the horrible danger was over. It had escaped. It was ready for life again. So the fly seems to have escaped. The fly, thanks to the boss who took the fly out of the ink pot and put it in the blotting paper, the fly began or initiated a drying process, and the drying process ended, and now it seems to be ready for life again. But just then the boss had an idea. He plunged his pen back into the ink, leaned his thick wrist on the blotting paper, and as the fly dried his wings, down came a great heavy blot. Now this is the very complex sadomasochistic episode which this particular section begins to dramatize, because the boss is obviously being a sadist in terms of torturing the fly, in terms of trying out the strength of the fly, in dropping blots of ink on it successively. But also, as you find out when you read this episode in more details through the fine print, the boss also wants the fly to win, to emerge as victorious, because the fly's struggle to emerge out of that trauma, to emerge out of that loss of the catastrophe, it almost takes an allegorical quality, because the boss sees himself in the fly. The boss sort of projects his own struggle, projects his own sort of survival onto the fly's action over here. So a part of the boss wants the fly to win as well. So when he's dropping the blots of ink on the fly, a part of him is getting tortured as well. And therein lies the importance of the human metaphors, the human anatomical metaphors, face, legs, body, etc., which the fly becomes sort of essentially humanized in quality through amplification, right? So the amplification and humanization go hand in hand in this particular section. So down came a great heavy blot. What would it make of that? What indeed? The little beggar seemed absolutely cowed, stunned, and afraid to move because of what would happen next. So again, the word beggar is important, the little beggar. But then as it painfully, it dragged itself forward. The front legs waved, caught hold, and most slowly this time, the task began from the beginning. Right? So the fly again, and this is the Sisyphean quality that I talked about. So you push a stone up on the top of a hill, and then the stone drops down again, or rolls down again immediately, and you're destined to push it back on the top another time, knowing fully well, with the knowledge that the stone will drop down or roll down again. So that becomes an activity, an exercise in futility. So obviously the fly dried itself very painfully, but just when it's about to fly off or take off with its wings, the boss had an idea, a sort of a sadomasochistic idea, a cruel idea of dropping another blot of ink on the fly. So the task began from the beginning. He's a plucky little devil, thought the boss, and I felt a real admiration for the fly's courage. So again, if you look at the metaphors, plucky little devil, these are very traditionally manly metaphors, used in sports, for instance, used in military, for instance. It's almost like an admiration for someone's strength, fortitude, bravery. So plucky is a very, very typically manly word used among men in certain situations of war and sports. And I felt a real admiration for the fly's courage. So, he's admiring the fly's courage, almost like a manly admiration for another man's courage. That was the way to tackle things. That was the right spirit. Never said I. It was only a question of. But the fly had again finished at its laborious task, and the boss had just time to refill his pen, to shake fair and square on the new clean body yet another dark drop. So the fly began the task of drying itself, and then it managed to dry itself after a very intense labor a very slowed down period of time where it went on, and the wings went on and on, the legs went on and on, and in the end it somehow managed to dry itself. The boss had just time to refill his pen to Shakespeare and Squire on a new clean body, yet another dark drop. So the boss is obviously torturing the fly by deciding to drop another blot of ink on the fly. What about it this time? A painful moment of suspense followed, but behold, the front legs were again waving. The boss felt a rush of relief. So again, this is what I mean when I say there's a degree of empathy also that the boss happens to have with the fly, because a part of him is admiring the fly's courage. A part of him is admiring the fly's never say die or never give up attitude, because that becomes some kind of a projection of his own attitude of life. That the very traditionally quote unquote manly attitude of never giving up or never say die, which a fly seems to enact to this particular struggle. So, and this is what I mean when I say this whole episode becomes still a masochistic in quality. It's not just sadist. Of course it's sadist. The boss has been cruel and dropping blots of ink on the fly, but also it's equally masochistic. I mean, when the fly is getting tortured, when the fly is trying to win, is trying to come out or emerge out of this crisis, a part of the boss wants the fly to emerge out as well. So therein lies this dualism at play. Okay, so the boss felt a rush of relief. He leaned over the fly and said to it tenderly, "You awful little," and so, maybe the word is bastard or whatever, you don't quite know, but again, it's one of those typical manly words which are used almost with grudging admiration. When you grudgingly admire someone, and these are kinds of words which we use. Plucky little devil, for instance. Devil is traditionally a negative connotation, but plucky little devil becomes so positive, true, and negative. And actually had the brilliant notion of breathing on it to help the drying process. So this is the really complex existential situation at work, because on one hand the boss is dropping ink on the fly, and on the other hand the boss is wanting the fly to win, to come out of it victorious or emerge out of it laborious, so, triumphant, sorry. So he's actually breathing on the fly in order to help the drying process. So he's dropping the ink in the first place as well as breathing on the fly to help the drying process. So it's a very complex agentic activity at play. All the same, there was something timid and weak about its efforts now. So we can see the fly is dying, he's losing out his vigor. And the boss decided that this time should be the last, and as he dipped the pen deep into the ink pot. So he dipped the pen again into the ink pot, very, very deep, just to take up as much ink as possible and to really throw or hurl a really heavy, dense drop. Right? But at the same time, he decided that by this point in time that this would be the last drop. This would be the final drop. This should be the last. It was. Right, now let's look at the finality of the sentence, the sense of finality, the sense of dramatic finality about the sentence. Just two words, it was. And that has almost an apocalyptic quality, that almost has a clinically complete quality about it. It's about a clinical closure. It was. The last blot fell on the soaked blotting paper, and the draggled fly lay in it and did not stir. The back legs were stuck to the body, the front legs were not to be seen. So, obviously it becomes a mangled corpse. And again, legs, body, front legs, back legs. So these become, the fly really becomes magnified visually in the boss's eyes. And that, because it is focalized to the boss, we as readers also see the fly as some kind of a magnificently magnified animal, and obviously through a very decelerated time as well. "Come on," said the boss, "look sharp," and he stirred it with the pen in vain. Nothing happened or was likely to happen. The fly was dead. So the boss obviously is now desperately trying to egg on the fly, stir the fly, give it some kind of a nourishment through verbal, to words, to gestures, etc. So he's trying to stir the fly with his pen, but in vain. Nothing happened. All was likely to happen. The fly was dead. Right? So in a way, this becomes interestingly, like I said, there's a sense of clinical closure about it, and everything comes to an end with this fly. The fly was dead. The boss lifted the corpse on the end of the paper knife and flung it into the waste paper basket. So again, the word corpse is important, because the word corpse is normally used for human dead bodies, right? So this is what I mean when I say the fly is humanized over here, but not in a nice way. The fly is humanized over here in order to dramatize the extent of violence on the fly's body. And one can, of course, read the whole episode as an allegory of the violence done to the young men during the war. The young men who were sent to the war to fight, and they become fodder for the entire lust for power, the entire lust for territory, etc. So the fly becomes, among the many things, the fly becomes also a metaphor of the young men, the youth, who lost their lives in a war, in a completely purposeless and directionless war. So the superfluity, the Sisyphean quality of the fly episode is also connected or connectable to the Sisyphean quality of the war. So therein lies the interesting equation. The boss lifted the corpse at the end of the paper knife and flung it under the waste paper basket, but such a grinding feeling of wretchedness seized him that he felt positively frightened. He started forward and pressed the bell for Macy. So, this is interesting because if you look at the seemingly oxymoronic quality, he felt positively frightened. So, he's engulfed with fear, he's possessed by fear, he felt positively frightened. So frightening or fear almost becomes a positive quality in its intensity. It just completely consumes him. He's completely moved by fear. The feeling of wretchedness seized him, consumed him, took possession of him, owned him, and he felt positively frightened. So, he's completely filled with fear, owned by fear. There's a territorial quality about fear at play. It takes over his body, it takes over his entire cognitive system, his self. He started forward and pressed the bell for Macy. Now he's calling his, messenger secretary in desperation. "Bring me some fresh blotting paper," he said sternly, and looked sharp about him. And while the old dog padded away, he fell to wondering what it was he had been thinking about before. What was it? He took out his handkerchief and passed it inside his collar. For the life of him, he could not remember. So that's the end of the story. But what happens is really, really complex from a cognitive level, from a psychological level, from a existential level, and of course from a gendered level as well, and the level of gender performance. So he's desperately trying to reassert his authority after having lost with the fly, because he wanted the fly to win. He wanted to see the fly emerge as victorious, but of course that did not happen. So as a result of which, he feels positively frightened. He feels so exhausted and completely enervated of all kinds of vigor. So in a very desperate attempt to regain his authority, he presses the bell for Macy, he calls him and says, "Bring me some fresh blotting paper." So, this idea of bringing some fresh blotting paper becomes some kind of desperate attempt to articulate authority. And then, of course, he follows it up by saying, "And look sharp about it, so do it quickly, hurry up." And while the old dog padded away, so again, look at the interesting way in which the humans, the actual humans in the story, are so dehumanized, described as a dog, for instance, Macy. Whereas we had just seen how the fly, which is an insect, was humanized in terms of being amplified visually. And while the old dog padded away, he fell to wondering what was it that he had been thinking about before. So he's trying to remember what was he that he was trying to think about before. What was it? He took out his handkerchief and passed it inside his collar. So he's obviously sweating, perhaps in fear, perhaps in nervousness, perhaps in exhaustion. For the life of him, he could not remember. Now, obviously, this is, he is forgotten, and, the whole story ends with a note of forgetfulness or forgetting. Now, if you remember, this is exactly what Woodfield's condition was at the beginning of the story. He came to tell something to the boss, and he couldn't remember. His hands were shaking, and his beard was growing red. But for the life of him, he couldn't remember what it was that he wanted to tell the boss. And at that point in time, the boss had been in complete cognitive control. And so he very patronizingly gave whiskey to Woodfield to help him recover. But by the time the story ends, we find the boss is pretty much the same plane as Woodfield was, in terms of not able to articulate, in terms of not able to have any cognitive control over his senses. So what the fly episode does is that it essentially enervates or liquidates the agency of the boss. The agency is liquidated completely. So he becomes an emptied out man. And he, in a sense, he can't remember anything. And obviously, as we know by now, he doesn't really have a future to look forward to because the son is dead. So he becomes, very perversely stuck to the present. Without any past, he can't remember it. And of course, without any future. So essentially, he becomes, in a very perverse sense, a timeless man. In a very negative sense, a timeless man. So he's shivering, he's full of fear, and he's pulling on his handkerchief and trying to rub off sweat from his collar, but for the life of him, he could not remember. So for the life of him, for all his desperate attempt to regain his agency and condition back, he can't remember what it was he was thinking about before. So the whole idea of masculinity, the whole idea of having this agentic, authoritative masculinity is decimated in the end. So the story becomes a very scathing, a very strong feminist attack, a feminist critique of a certain kind of masculinity, a masculinity which is authoritative, which is certain of the certainties, which is full of convictions, which is pompous in quality. So that masculinity is first presented to us in all its glory, surrounded by new furniture, new gadgets, social success, etc. But as the story progresses, we find that masculinity model is more and more decimated by the narratorial voice in the story. And then, of course, by the time the story ends, that kind of a gendered identity or gendered agency goes completely out of the window. For the boss cannot even remember what he was thinking of before. I mean, forget about having any other kind of agency, right? So the whole idea of agency and gendered identity is inverted over here, and we have a very interesting problematization of gendered identity, because we saw earlier how it was a woman who were traveling to Belgium, it was a woman who were traveling, who were allowing the men to leave home, or sort of restricting them in terms of deciding whether or not they should leave home at certain times of the day or certain times of the week, etc. So the woman seemed to have, at least appeared to have, more agency in terms of controlling spatial temporality, whereas the men at the end turn out to be memoryless men, weak men, mourning men, who do not quite have the agency to be authoritative anymore. So if we finish the story and then go back in the beginning of the story, we find the entire idea of authority of the boss is a very superficial architecture, which is quite fragile in quality, which can be decimated at any given point of time with any kind of internal, it doesn't really have to be an external invasion. It will decay away internally. There's a big degree of internal decadence about that kind of masculinity, which was obviously some part of a strategy of the boss to feel important, to feel privileged, etc. And just to wind up, what we have seen already is that how the boss had equated prestige with trauma. So his trauma, his loss of his son, had a prestige quotient to it, which he thought was unique in compared to other people's losses. So his son was an only son, so he had told himself, he had congratulated himself on the fact that he could weep at will in terms of thinking about his son, his dead son, at any given point of time. But of course we see in the end that this part of the story that he cannot weep anymore, because like every other person, his grief too had dried. So this drying down of grief becomes a symbol of loss of agency, because as I mentioned, there's a very interesting equation with agency and grief over here. And of course the fly episode becomes a desperate attempt, a sadomasochistic drama on the part of the boss to see if he can play out his own attempts on the fly, map it onto the fly, and of course the fly dies in the end. So the boss becomes both the torturer and the tortured in this particular episode, hence the entire sadomasochistic bit. And so the fly is dead, and the boss's not ability to remember completely decimate the model of masculinity that he had presented earlier in the story. So this concludes our reading of Fly, and we can obviously connect this very interestingly with the bell hooks essay on patriarchy, because the boss is very much one of those patriarchal men who are completely confident, who are completely closed in their convictions, etc. But what the story does, from a very, very powerful feminist perspective, it completely cracks open that privilege of patriarchy. It completely cracks open that model of masculinity, and it shows it as fragile and vulnerable and completely weak at this point of time. So go through the story please one more time, and hopefully we've covered most of the important issues which are relevant for this particular course. So with that, we conclude Catherine Mansfield's short story, The Fly. We'll move on to a next text in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.